They call it the Great Quiet, the final benediction of the architects. It wasn't a piece forged in fire, but one that descended like a gentle, terminal frost. The last human flags were folded and stored in sterile archives a century ago, not long after the sky bled with the fire of our own making during the final war. We had screamed ourselves hoarse, shattered our world, and, in the exhausted silence that followed, they arrived. The architects didn't come in warships. Their vessels were like cathedral bells cast in ivory and light, gliding through the orbital debris of our self-destruction with a placid, unnerving grace. They offered us a choice that was no choice at all. Join their chorus. A galactic symphony of assimilated cultures, or be left to the dissonance of our own ruin. We chose the gilded cage, and for 100 years, humanity had not raised its voice above a whisper. My name is Elian, and my life's work was tending to the bars of that cage. I was a mnemonic archivist, third class, a glorified curator of forgetting. My office was a clean, white room in the spire of tranquil history over what was once called Geneva, and my job was to sift through the digital ghosts of pre-chorus humanity, redacting the ugliness. I pruned the branching paths of our past, trimming away the concepts the architects deemed atonal, words like defiance, rage, ambition, war. Our official history became a gentle, pastoral melody, a story of a simple people who stumbled into technology too grand for their emotional grasp and were mercifully saved from themselves. We were children, and the architects were our patient, eternal parents. I wore the gray tunic of a civil servant, ate the nutrient paste that calmed the mind, and took the weekly sublimation mists that scrubbed away inconvenient passions. I was a good son of the chorus, but every night I dreamt of thunder. My grandfather had been born just before the quiet. He never spoke of it, not directly. But I remembered the look in his eyes when he'd take me to the edge of the reclamation zones, where the skeletal remains of old cities clawed at the sky. He'd point a trembling finger and whisper a single word. More. That was all. Just more. He was gone now, his memory sublimated like all the others, but the word remained, a splinter in my mind. The discovery that broke my world began with a routine decommissioning order, a pre-chorus server farm. Sector Gamma 9, deep in the frozen Siberian plains, was slated for final purification. It was an ancient, sprawling complex from the late days of the final war, a place where our ancestors had stored the sum of their knowledge, their fury, their art, their madness. The architects' cleansing protocols were ruthlessly efficient, wiping terabytes of history with waves of corrosive data phages. But this facility was different. It had been flash fossilized by an electromagnetic pulse in the war's last moments, its core systems fused into solid state, shielded from the outside world by miles of ice and rock. My task was simple: oversee the final meltdown of the core, ensuring no atonal data could ever be recovered. I stood on a gantry of cold metal, watching the reclamation drones drill toward the central chamber, their high-frequency cutters whining in the frigid air. The air was thin, tasting of ozone and forgotten time. The lead drone breached the final wall, and a cascade of corrupted data flickered across my console, a final, meaningless scream from a dead world. But then, something else. A single packet of data, impossibly small, impossibly intact, shot through the drone's relay before the system crashed. It wasn't a library or an archive. It was a key. A bootstrap file so elegantly encrypted it slipped through the purification filters like a ghost. It bypassed my official Chorus-issued datapad and lodged itself in the diagnostic port of my personal chrono unit, a relic my grandfather had given me. No one noticed. The meltdown commenced, and Sector Gamma 9 was erased from history. I signed the report, took my transport back to the sterile comfort of the spire, and, for 3 days, I did nothing. The key burned in my chrono unit, a silent, radioactive presence. The sublimation mists felt different, thinner, as if they could no longer reach the deepest parts of my mind. The nutrient paste tasted like ash. On the 4th night, I sealed my apartment, cut the internal surveillance feeds, a minor infraction punishable by memory wiping, and interfaced my chrono unit with a shielded terminal. The key opened a door not onto a database, but into a simulation, a living memory. It called itself the Anvil. It was not a place of tidy facts and redacted reports. It was the raw, screaming soul of what we had been. The first file I opened was music. It wasn't the placid, harmonic hum of the chorus. It was savage and loud. A beautiful, furious noise of drums and electric strings that made my heart hammer against my ribs. They called it rock and roll. The next was a poem, full of blood and love and regret. Words that felt like they could cut glass. Then came the histories. The real ones. I saw humanity claw its way from mud and stone, build empires that turned to dust, create art that defied gods, and wage wars that salted the earth. I saw our cruelty, our pettiness, our infinite capacity for self-destruction, and I saw our glory. I saw a lone man stand before a column of tanks, a scientist weep at the sight of a new galaxy in her telescope, a soldier drag his wounded brother through a field of fire. We were not gentle shepherds who lost our way. We were wolves. We were titans. We were a symphony of beautiful, terrible chaos. For weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was Elian, the quiet archivist, nodding placidly as my architect overseer, the observer designated Lyra, praised my diligence in sanitizing our past. Lyra was typical of its kind, a being of flowing light and crystalline thought. Its voice a series of perfectly modulated chimes that resonated directly in the mind. It moved with a serene grace that made humans look like clumsy, unfinished creatures. It would hover in my office, its formless head tilted in a gesture of benign curiosity. Your species finds such peace in simplicity. Elian. Its chimes would echo in my skull. The burden of your history was a cacophony. The chorus has granted you the gift of a single, perfect note. I would bow my head and agree, my heart pounding with the secret rhythm of the anvil. But at night, I descended into that glorious, forbidden cacophony. I learned of our science, the physics of folded space we'd mastered, the genetics that allowed us to rewrite our own code, the artificial intelligences that were not just servants, but partners, companions. The architects had told us we were a Type 1 civilization, barely capable of harnessing our planet's energy. We had been on the cusp of Type 3, a species reaching for the stars, not with timid hands, but with fists. The final war wasn't a tribal squabble. It was a war of ideology fought between factions that controlled entire solar systems. We hadn't been saved from ourselves. We had been neutered at the height of our power, caught in a moment of weakness, and chained before we could recover. The anvil was more than history. It was a weapon. Buried in its code were schematics for technologies the architects had banned: zero-point energy reactors, self-replicating nanites, and something called a cognitive scythe, a weapon that didn't destroy matter but erased information, a conceptual blade. Our ancestors had built weapons that could kill gods. The turning point came during the Festival of Harmonic Convergence, a mandatory celebration of our assimilation. The sky above the spire was filled with shimmering light sculptures, and the air thrummed with the chorus's endless, placid song. We were all gathered in the Grand Plaza, tens of thousands of humans in identical gray tunics, our faces placid from the ceremonial mists, our minds numb. Lyra was there, addressing the crowd not with words, but with waves of pure emotion, contentment, serenity, gratitude. As the wave of synthetic peace washed over me, I felt a surge of something else, something ugly and atonal, rising from the depths of the anvil inside me. Rage, a pure, clean, human rage. It was so potent, so alien in this tranquilized world that for a moment I thought I would scream. I saw the crowd around me, my people, with their blank eyes and gentle smiles, and I didn't see peace. I saw a graveyard of souls. That night, I stopped being a student of the past and decided to become its agent. Using my high-level access, I began the most dangerous work of my life. I couldn't broadcast the anvil's truths. The chorus network would detect and purge it in seconds. But I could hide them. I started embedding fragments of our lost history into the sanitized archives, a conceptual insurgency, a line of a forbidden poem woven into the metadata of an agricultural report. The schematic for a simple kinetic firearm hidden in the architectural plans for a new meditation temple. The face of a forgotten general, a hero of the final war, ghosted into a crowd scene in an official historical mural. It was slow, painstaking work, like planting seeds of razor wire in a garden of silk. Lyra sensed the shift. Its visits became more frequent, its chiming voice laced with a subtle dissonance. You seem distracted, Elian. It projected one afternoon, its light form shimmering with something I could almost identify as suspicion. Your work is exemplary, yet your core resonance is turbulent. The chorus is a calm sea. It is unwise to create ripples. I feigned illness, a minor neurological imbalance, and it seemed to accept this. But I knew I was on borrowed time. The architects were not gods. They were wardens. And they had just noticed a crack in the cell wall. The anvil had one final secret, buried in its deepest, most encrypted layer. It wasn't a schematic or history. It was a message. A final, desperate broadcast from the leader of a resistance cell known only as Prometheus. The message was a simple set of coordinates and a single, chilling sentence. The Orc cloud remembers what the worlds have forgotten. It was a call into the void, a gamble on the hope that someone, someday, would find the key and have the courage to listen. The choice was clear. I could stay here, a ghost in the machine, planting my tiny seeds of rebellion until Lyra's patience ran out and I was sublimated into quiet oblivion. Or I could answer the call. I could leave the cage, not knowing if I was flying toward freedom or a colder, darker prison. That night, I used the anvil's knowledge to fabricate a flight plan for a Class C orbital hauler, a slow, outdated vessel used for shipping nutrient paste to the orbital stations. I scrubbed my identity from the spire's census, leaving behind a ghost file that would loop my daily routine for weeks before anyone noticed. As I walked through the silent, sleeping city toward the spaceport, The chorus song humming in the air felt like a funeral dirge. I looked up at the stars, the ones the architects allowed us to see, and, for the first time, I didn't feel a sense of tranquil wonder. I felt the call of an infinite, empty battlefield. My grandfather had told me we were more. He was right. We were more than this quiet, gray existence. We were thunder, and the great quiet had lasted long enough. It was time to make some noise. I boarded the hauler, its engines humming with a low, steady power that felt like a promise. As the ship lifted from the cradle, rising above the glowing, sterile perfection of the world I had always known, a single clear thought cut through a lifetime of indoctrination. A thought born of forbidden knowledge and a century of suppressed rage. The architects saw us as a broken instrument, a discordant note to be smoothed out of existence. They were about to learn that some instruments were not meant to play soft melodies. Some were meant to be drums of war. The journey outward was a lesson in a new kind of silence. On Earth, the great quiet was a presence, an engineered absence of noise that hummed just beneath the threshold of hearing, a constant, gentle pressure on the soul. Out here, in the cold dark between worlds, the silence was a void. It didn't press. It pulled. It was a vacuum that threatened to draw out every thought, every memory, leaving nothing but the rhythmic thrum of the hauler's life support and the frantic beating of my own heart. For the first week, I expected pursuit. I imagined Lyra's shimmering form coalescing in the cockpit, its chiming voice expressing disappointment before my consciousness was snuffed out. I saw architect vessels, those impossible ivory bells, gliding into view, their placid beauty a herald of my obliteration. But nothing came. The architects didn't chase. They simply assumed there was nowhere to run. Their control was so total, so atmospheric, that the concept of a human simply leaving the designated zones was a logical impossibility, a rounding error they would eventually correct. This assumption, I realized, was the single greatest weakness I had found in the Anvil's analysis of their psychology. They were perfect, and perfection is incapable of imagining its own failure. My ship, the stray dog as I'd christened it after a fragment of a pre-chorus poem, was a clumsy beast, never designed for this kind of journey. Its nutrient-paced cargo had been jettisoned into a solar orbit, a minor act of rebellion that felt disproportionately satisfying. I spent my time not as a passenger, but as a student, a monk in a monastery of one. The anvil was my teacher. I devoured its contents, letting the raw, unfiltered data of my species' history rewire my brain. I learned to navigate by the light of dead stars, using pulsar charts our ancestors had mapped millennia ago. I studied basic engineering, my soft archivist's hands growing calloused as I learned to coax efficiency from the hauler's aging reactor, rerouting power to strengthen the electromagnetic shielding, a trick I'd gleaned from a file on primitive stealth technology. I ran combat simulations, my mind recoiling at first from the brutal logic of tactical warfare, my body flinching at the phantom impact of plasma bolts and kinetic slugs. The architects had taught us that violence was a disease of the primitive mind. The anvil taught me it was a tool, as elegant and terrible as a surgeon's scalpel, to be used when all other options had been severed. My body changed, too. Without the calming mists and the sedative nutrients, my mind began to race with thoughts that were sharp, chaotic, and terrifyingly my own. My muscles, accustomed to a life of placid inactivity, ached with the strain of the ship's maintenance. I was shedding the gray skin of the chorus, and the raw nerves underneath were screaming. It was a painful, agonizing rebirth, and I welcomed every moment of it. The inner planets, with their orbital rings and chorus terraform landscapes, fell away, replaced by the raw, untamed majesty of the gas giants. Jupiter was a raging storm of color, a deity of physics that cared nothing for the chorus's perfect note. Saturn's rings were a glittering, silent testament to the universe's beautiful, chaotic indifference. This was the world the architects had tried to pave over, a cosmos not of harmony, but of violence and creation, of dying stars and newborn worlds. It was a universe that understood humanity perfectly. After months of travel, I reached the coordinates Prometheus had left behind. I arrived in the Oort cloud, the final frozen frontier of our solar system. It was a graveyard of comets, trillions of chunks of ice and rock sleeping in the deep cold, their orbits barely tethered to a sun that was now just the brightest star in a sea of indifferent lights. The coordinates led to nothing, just empty, star-dusted blackness. A cold dread, far deeper than the vacuum outside the hull, seeped into me. Had I come all this way for a ghost a final? Cruel joke from a long-dead resistance. For 2 days I drifted, the hope that had burned so brightly in my chest sputtering into a cold ember, my rage, my purpose. It all felt like the delusion of a madman in a cage who had mistaken a crack in the wall for an open door. But the anvil was not a book of jokes. It was a testament of will. Prometheus wouldn't have sent someone on a fool's errand. I wasn't looking for a city. I was looking for a secret. I began to scan the region, not with the broad sensors of the hauler, but through the subtle, analytical lens of the anvil's knowledge. I ignored heat signatures and radio waves, the obvious signs of life the architects would look for. Instead, I searched for their absence. I looked for gravitational anomalies, for pockets of space where the celestial mechanics were just slightly wrong, for shadows that were too perfect, for fields of debris that moved in patterns too regular to be natural. On the third day, I found it. A rogue planetoid, a chunk of nickel iron 10 kilometers across, designated in old star charts as Charon's gift. It was tumbling through the void, its trajectory calculated to appear random. But its gravitational field was inconsistent. It was too light for its size. It was hollow. As I approached, its surface resolved into a masterpiece of camouflage, a mosaic of ice and rock that perfectly mimicked the surrounding comets. There was no visible hangar, no docking bay, no welcoming light. There was only a single, repeating broadcast on a tightly encrypted, obsolete frequency. It wasn't a message, it was a question. What is the weight of a song? A computerized voice asked in a forgotten dialect of pre-chorus English. It was a line from a poem in the Anvil, a work by a poetess named Anya Sharma, who had written it on the eve of the final war's last battle. The Anvil provided the answer, a response that was not a word, but a sequence of prime numbers, a mathematical representation of the poem's meter. I transmitted the sequence. For a long, heart-stopping minute, nothing happened. Then, a section of the planetoid surface dissolved, not opening like a door, but retracting like an iris, revealing a cavern of dark, raw metal within. I guided the stray dog inside, the iris closing behind me with a silent, absolute finality. The hangar was vast, cold, and brutally functional. Scars of old repairs lined the walls, and the air tasted of metal and recycled oxygen. There were ships here, angular and ugly things that looked more like weapons than vessels. Their hulls patched and repainted so many times they looked like armored scar tissue. Before my ship's engines had even cooled, my ramp was forced open, and the cockpit was flooded with figures in patched, archaic pressure suits, their helmet visors polarized to an opaque black. They carried kinetic rifles, brutal-looking weapons that fired physical projectiles, a technology so primitive the architects considered it beneath notice. They moved with a predatory economy of motion that made my skin crawl. These were not the placid, gray-clad people of Earth. These were hunters. They dragged me from my cockpit, their gloved hands hard and unforgiving. I didn't resist. Inside the station, which they called the Bastion, the reality of a century of resistance hit me like a physical blow. The corridors were tight, dimly lit tunnels carved from raw rock, buzzing with the hum of overworked life support and flickering screens. People passed in the halls, their faces etched with a hardness I had only seen in the Anvil's war archives. They were thin, gaunt, with the pale skin of people who had never seen a real sun, their eyes holding a watchful, weary intelligence. There were no gray tunics here, only practical jumpsuits, stained with grease and sweat. This wasn't a government in exile, it was a tribe of ghosts, haunting the edge of a system that had forgotten them. They took me to a chamber that served as their command center. A woman stood before a holographic map of the solar system, her back to me. She was tall, with short-cropped white hair that seemed to defy the dim light, and she wore a simple black jumpsuit that did nothing to hide the lean, wiry strength of her frame. When she turned, her face was a mask of stern, unforgiving pragmatism. Her eyes, a startling pale blue, were the oldest I had ever seen. They held no hope, only a cold, burning resolve. "I am Kalen," she said, her voice a low, gravelly thing, devoid of any warmth. "And you are either the greatest fool in a century or the most elaborate trap the architects have ever designed." I'm leaning toward the latter. She gestured to the guards. "Take him to the Crucible. I want to know what he is." The Crucible was not a torture chamber. It was something far more intimate and terrifying. It was a small, spherical room where they strapped me into a chair and attached a neural interface to my temples, a crude but powerful device based on the same principles as the cognitive scythe. An old man with hands stained by solder and a face like a dried apple oversaw the process. "We can't filter the chorus out here with mists," he rasped, not looking at me. "We have to burn it out. This will search for the architect's conditioning, the deep-level harmonics they embed in every human mind on Earth. If it finds them, it will erase them, and you along with them. If you're clean, it will simply show us who you are. All of you." The process began. It wasn't pain. It was an invasion. The machine ripped through my mind, tearing through the placid memories of my life as an archivist, the gentle chimes of Lyra, the soft gray comfort of my apartment. It was searching for the foreign code, the architect's signature. I felt the machine begin to recoil, to identify the chorus's deep-seated influence, the lifetime of subliminal control. But then, I unleashed the anvil. I didn't just remember the knowledge, I let it become me. I flooded the Crucible with the raw, chaotic, beautiful fury of a species that had clawed its way to sentience. I gave it the rage of Achilles, the sorrow of Lear, The defiant joy of a guitarist playing a solo in a thunderstorm. The cold, calculating genius of a general sacrificing a pawn to win a war. I showed it the love of a mother for her child and the hatred of a soldier for his enemy. I inundated it with so much atonal, unstructured, passionate humanity that the machine couldn't process it. Alarms blared. The old man shouted. Through the psychic static, I felt Kalen's presence, watching, analyzing. I focused on a single memory from the anvil, a recording of the poet Anya Sharma reading her own work on the night before she died, defending a barricade. I let her voice fill the space, a human voice, full of fear and hope and an unbreakable will. What is the weight of a song? I screamed into the mental void. It is the weight of the last breath of the singer, given freely, so that the notes might echo in the silence that follows. The machine shrieked and disengaged. I slumped in the chair, gasping, my mind feeling like it had been scoured with sand. The guards helped me up, their grip still firm but no longer hostile. Kalen stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her pale eyes narrowed in thought. She had watched the entire thing on a monitor, had seen the raw data of my mind laid bare. "He's clean," the old man grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "More than clean. He's loud." Kalen walked toward me, circling me like a predator inspecting a strange new animal. She stopped in front of me, her face unreadable. "You found the anvil," she stated. It wasn't a question. I nodded, my throat too raw to speak. Prometheus believed it could be a weapon, a key to reawakening our species. He thought that if we could just show them what they had been, they would rise up. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "You brought us a history book, archivist. You brought us stories of thunder, but we were born in the silence. We have been fighting a real war, not a simulation. So don't you dare expect us to be the heroes you read about. The humanity that survived out here is not the one from your poems. We are the thing the poems warned you about." Life in the Bastion was a brutal education. The stories of heroism and glory I'd absorbed from the anvil were sandblasted away by the harsh reality of a century-long guerrilla war fought in the shadows. These were not the shining knights of pre-chorus legend. They were scavengers, saboteurs, and survivors. Their humanity honed to a razor's edge by necessity and loss. Their culture was a Spartan tapestry woven from threads of paranoia, pragmatism, and a deep, abiding hatred for the architects. Children were taught engineering and demolitions alongside their alphabet. Food was a constant concern, grown in hydroponic bays under the sickly glow of UV lamps or scavenged during daring. High-risk raids on chorus supply depots. Every piece of equipment was a relic, meticulously maintained, cannibalized from other relics, and cherished like a holy artifact. There were no artists or poets here, only mechanics, soldiers, and strategists. The only art they practiced was the art of staying alive. My arrival was a disruption, a stone tossed into a stagnant pool. At first, I was a curiosity, the Earthsider, the soft man who had never known true hunger or fear. They watched me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. My knowledge from the anvil, which I had believed would make me a messiah, was initially treated as a dangerous abstraction. When I tried to speak of the great political philosophies of our ancestors, they would point to the cracks in the hull that needed patching. When I quoted the stirring words of forgotten generals, They would hand me a plasma cutter and tell me to get to work fabricating replacement parts for the life support system. Kalen assigned me to the lowest rung of their society, a reclamation crew, under the command of a man named Jorik. Jorik was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of scars, his hands thick and calloused from decades of hard labor. He had been born in the Bastion, had never seen a sky, and viewed me with an open, uncomplicated disdain. Stories don't stop vacuum leaks. Archivist. He grunted on our first shift, shoving a heavy power conduit into my hands. Our job was to venture out into the Oort cloud in a small, rugged salvage ship called the Tatterdemalion. Picking through the debris of the final war, we were cosmic garbage men, hunting for salvageable alloys, dormant power cores, and, most importantly, caches of pre-chorus technology that had been blasted into the void a century ago. It was dangerous, grueling work. The debris fields were unstable, riddled with unexploded ordnance and pockets of lingering radiation. More than once, our ship was pelted by micrometeoroids, forcing us to make emergency repairs in the crushing emptiness of space, our lives dependent on the integrity of our aging pressure suits. During those long, silent excursions, I learned the Bastion's real history, not from an archive, but from the quiet, bitter words of Jorik and his crew. They were the descendants of the scattered, military remnants and refugee fleets that had refused to surrender after the final war. They had fled into the dark, hiding in hollowed-out asteroids and the atmospheres of gas giants, waging a war of pinpricks and phantoms against an enemy that barely acknowledged their existence. For every minor victory, a sabotaged chorus comms relay, a pirated shipment of medical supplies, they had suffered a dozen crushing defeats. Entire habitats had been discovered and pacified by the architects. Their populations either assimilated or simply erased. Their homes turned into cold, silent tombs. The Bastion was the last significant holdout, the final flickering ember of a fire that had once consumed a solar system. Their fight wasn't for victory, it was for defiance. They fought so that the memory of a humanity that stood on its own 2 feet would not be utterly extinguished. My turning point with Yorisk came during a salvage run in a particularly dense debris field known as the Graveyard of Giants, the final resting place of several capital ships from the war. We were hunting for a specific prize, the rumored remains of the Geeks S. Vengeance, a warship that was said to have carried an early prototype of the cognitive scythe. As we navigated the field, a dormant proximity mine, a relic of the war, activated and crippled our ship's primary engine. We were dead in the water, our life support failing, our communications array shattered. Panic, a cold and greasy thing, began to set in among the crew. Jorik, ever the pragmatist, was already calculating our remaining hours of oxygen. While he tried to rally the crew for a desperate, likely fatal attempt to repair the engine from the outside, I retreated to a terminal, my mind racing. The anvil wasn't just stories, it was data. I cross-referenced the schematics of our damaged engine with a database of Final War-era naval technology. In the archives of the Vengeance's sister ship, I found a footnote in a field engineer's log about an emergency protocol, a way to bypass the damaged plasma injectors and hotwire the ship's reactor directly to the impulse drive. It was a wildly dangerous one-shot maneuver that had a 90% chance of overloading the reactor and vaporizing us all. I brought the plan to Jorik. He looked at the schematics, then at me. His eyes filled with a new kind of appraisal. "You're telling me you learned how to do this from a history book," he growled. "It's not a book. It's the collected knowledge of the people who built these ships. I countered. They knew how to break them, and they knew how to fix them. We had nothing to lose. For the next hour, he barked orders, his crew moving with a renewed sense of purpose while I guided them, my voice steady over the comms, translating the century-old technical jargon into practical instructions. The final connection had to be made manually. From inside the reactor housing, a space flooded with low-level radiation, Yorick went himself. When he emerged minutes later, his radiation suit singed. He gave me a single, sharp nod. The ship shuddered, groaned like a dying beast, and then the impulse drive roared to life. A violent, uncontrolled burst of power that threw us clear of the minefield. We limped back to the bastion, our ship half-wrecked but our crew alive. Yorick never mentioned it again, but his disdain for me was gone, replaced by a grudging, silent respect. I was no longer just the archivist. I was the one who could read the ghosts. News of what I had done reached Kaylin. She summoned me back to the command center. The holographic map still dominated the room, but this time she looked at me not as a potential threat, but as a potential asset. Yorick says you have a talent for finding needles in a cosmic haystack, she said, her tone as clipped and unsentimental as ever. The anvil is more than you claimed. It's a tactical database. It's everything, I replied. It's our entire civilization in a bottle. We've been fighting with scraps. It's time we started fighting with knowledge. I began to work directly with Kaylin's command staff, a small, grim circle of veterans who planned the Bastion's operations. My role was unique. I was their oracle, their archaeologist of war. Using the anvil, I could predict chorus shipping routes by analyzing their hyper-efficient and therefore predictable logistics algorithms. I could identify structural weaknesses in architect technology by studying the pre-chorus scientific principles they had co-opted and refined. I unearthed the locations of other lost caches, forgotten armories, and dormant automated defense platforms left over from the war. We were no longer just scavengers. We were becoming hunters, guided by the whispers of our dead ancestors. Our first major success was an operation I planned myself, codenamed Echo's End. The anvil contained information about a deep space comms relay near Uranus, a critical node in the Chorus network that broadcast the endless, pacifying song to the outer colonies. The architects considered it impregnable, protected by automated defense systems and a regenerative energy shield. But the anvil knew its secrets. It was built on the foundation of a pre-chorus experimental facility, and its shield had a back door, a specific frequency modulation that, if timed to the nanosecond, would cause a system-wide reboot. During that reboot, the shield would be down for exactly 3.4 seconds. It was a window of impossibility. Kaylin was skeptical, but the potential reward, blinding and deafening a tenth of the solar system, was too great to ignore. She assembled a strike team, the best she had. A silent, lethal squadron they called the Wraiths. I wasn't just the planner. I insisted on going with them. I had to be the one to transmit the frequency. It was a complex code, more like a piece of music than a command. And only I, with the anvil's direct guidance, could perform it. The mission was a blur of controlled violence and unbearable tension. We approached the relay in a stealth ship, its hull coated in radar-absorbent plating I'd designed from a forgotten schematic. The Wraiths, led by a quiet, deadly woman named Silas, boarded the station while I remained on the ship, my fingers poised over the transmitter. They fought through the station's robotic defenders, their kinetic weapons brutally effective against machines designed to repel energy attacks. With seconds to spare, Silas gave me the signal. I sent the code. The relay's energy signature vanished from my screen. For 3.4 seconds, it was vulnerable. Kalen had dispatched a single ship, armed with their last remaining nuclear torpedo, a relic of the final war. The torpedo struck true. The relay didn't just go silent, it detonated in a flash of light that was visible from the bastion. For the first time in a century, a significant part of the solar system was free from the chorus's song. The psychological impact was immense. On the bastion, for the first time I could remember, there were cheers. People looked at me differently. I was no longer the Earthsider. I was Prometheus, the Firebringer. But as I watched the celebration, a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Kalen stood beside me, her face showing no emotion. "They will answer this," she said quietly. "They are slow to anger, the architects, but their anger is absolute. You have woken the god, archivist. I hope you know how to kill it." Her words were a prophecy. The Great Quiet was over. Now, the Great War would begin. We had landed the first blow, a blow they never thought possible. But in doing so, we had revealed ourselves. We had told the shepherds that the wolves were not all dead, and we knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that the shepherds were now coming to burn down the forest. The architect's response was not the swift, fiery retribution we had anticipated. It was something far more terrifying, a slow, suffocating, and intelligent strangulation. They did not send a war fleet to the Oort cloud. They didn't need to. They began by tightening their grip on the worlds they already controlled. The serene, placid mask of the chorus began to slip, revealing the cold, calculating machinery of control that had always lain beneath. On Earth and the colonized inner planets, surveillance protocols intensified. The gentle sublimation mists were replaced by neurological audits, scans that could detect and flag atonal thoughts before they could even form into coherent dissent. The gray-clad civil servants were now flanked by silent, floating sentinels, chrome spheres that monitored the populace with an unnerving, silent vigilance. The architects were not punishing the bastion, they were cauterizing the very possibility of another rebellion ever taking root. This news trickled back to us through a network of covert listening posts and a few brave, deeply embedded sympathizers, their messages fragmented and increasingly desperate. The anvil, which had once seemed a key to our past, now felt like a eulogy. We had won a battle, but in doing so, we had triggered an immune response from the Galactic Order, and it was methodically sterilizing the wound. Morale in the bastion plummeted. Our victory at Echo's End now seemed hollow, a foolish act of provocation that had brought down the wrath of a patient, unfeeling God upon our forgotten brethren. The cheers were replaced by whispers, the whispers by a grim, resentful silence. Food was rationed more strictly, power was conserved with a miserly desperation, and the old paranoia, never far from the surface, returned with a vengeance. Kalen grew more remote, more severe, spending her days locked in the command center, poring over tactical readouts and dwindling resource reports. The weight of her people's survival rested entirely on her shoulders, a burden she bore with a stoic, almost inhuman endurance. It was during this period of creeping despair that I began to understand the true nature of the Bastion's long war. It wasn't about reclaiming Earth or defeating the architects in open combat. That was a child's fantasy. It was about preserving a choice. It was about ensuring that the idea of a free humanity, however battered and besieged, continued to exist. My role shifted once more. I was no longer an oracle of war, but a keeper of the flame. I used the anvil not to find targets, but to find hope. I established a small, hidden library in a disused sector of the bastion, projecting the art, music, and literature of our ancestors onto the cold rock walls. At first, few came. It was seen as a frivolous waste of energy. But slowly, a few curious souls began to drift in during their off-shifts. They would stand in silence, watching scenes of a vibrant, chaotic, and colorful Earth they had never known. They listened to the furious, joyful noise of a symphony, their faces a mixture of confusion and wonder. I would read them the poems of Anya Sharma, and for a few moments, the grim realities of their existence would recede, replaced by the ghost of a world where people had the luxury of feeling something other than fear or resolve. Yorick, to my surprise, became a regular visitor. He would stand for hours before a looping image of an ancient terrestrial ocean, its waves crashing against a rocky shore. "So much water," he would murmur, his voice filled with a kind of reverent awe. But this fragile cultural renaissance was a candle in a hurricane. Our supplies were dwindling, and the architects were beginning a systematic sweep of the outer system. They weren't hunting us. They were cleansing. Long-range drones, sleek and black like shards of obsidian, began meticulously charting and sterilizing every asteroid and comet large enough to house a secret. They were building a cage around us, drawing a line of absolute sterility across the solar system, and we were trapped on the wrong side of it when we were living on borrowed time. And the clock was ticking with an audible, menacing rhythm. The breaking point came with the discovery of the Leviathan. It was an anomaly detected by our deepest, most sensitive passive sensors, a ghost in the interstellar medium just beyond the Oort cloud. It was not an architect vessel. Its energy signature was all wrong, a chaotic, bioorganic mess that resonated with a strange familiarity, using the most obscure and fragmented data in the anvil excerpts from the logs of pre-chorus deep space explorers who had ventured into the void and never returned. I identified it. It was a Typhon-class bioship, one of the legendary and terrifying living weapons created by the Mechanists, a radical faction from the Final War. The Mechanists believed humanity's future lay in merging with technology, in becoming the ultimate predator. Their bioships were gargantuan, semi-sentient creatures of metal and flesh, capable of self-repair, adaptation, and a ferocity that had made even their allies recoil in horror. This one, the Grendel, had been thought lost in the war's final days. Now, it was awake. It was not moving toward us. It was moving toward the sun, toward the inner system, toward Earth. The architect's cleansing sweep had inadvertently woken it from a century of hibernation. Kaelin and her council saw it as a harbinger of doom, another monster unleashed upon a system already choking on monsters. But I saw something else. I saw an opportunity, a terrible, desperate, and magnificent opportunity. I went to Kaelin with a plan so audacious, so utterly insane, that I expected her to have me sedated and locked away. "We don't run from the cage," I told her, my voice trembling with the sheer scale of the idea. "We don't wait for the walls to close in. We take the bastion, our home, our ark, and we ride a monsters back to war. My proposal was this: we would use the Bastion's remaining power not to flee but to move, to intentionally place ourselves in the path of the Grendel. Using the Anvil's knowledge of mechanist biocoding and neural interface technology, we would attempt to do what no one, not even its creators, had ever fully managed to pacify the bioship, to latch onto its colossal form, and to steer it. We would turn their ultimate weapon into our Trojan horse, riding it past the Architect's cleansing line, straight into the heart of the system. We would hide in the shadow of a beast, and when the time was right, we would unleash that beast upon our shared enemy. The command center was silent for a full minute after I finished. The council members stared at me as if I had sprouted a second head. It was suicide. It was madness. But it was also the only plan that offered anything other than a slow, inevitable death. Kalen stared at the holographic image of the Leviathan, its chaotic energy signature a swirling vortex of red and black. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the pragmatist warring with the last desperate gambler. The anvil contains the command codes, she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Not codes, I corrected. A language. The mechanists didn't program their ships. They trained them. They communicated through patterns of pain and pleasure, reward and punishment, broadcast on a specific neural frequency. It would require a direct interface, a pilot, someone to become its rider. And this rider, she continued, her gaze unwavering, would be you. It was the only way. I was the only one with the deep, intuitive understanding of the Anvil's data, the only one who could hope to translate the cold logic of the archive into the living language of a bioengineered mind. The risk of psychic feedback, of being consumed by the creature's primal consciousness, was nearly absolute. Yorick, who was now a member of the council, slammed his fist on the table. This is a fool's errand. We are warriors, not beast tamers. We fight, and we die on our own terms, not as a parasite clinging to some forgotten horror. And what terms are those? Jorik, Kalen countered, her voice cutting through the tension. To starve in the dark, to watch our children forget the color of a sun they've never seen. The archivist's plan is madness. But it is a madness that moves forward. All our other options are a slow walk into a cold grave. She turned her pale, assessing eyes back to me. You believe you can do this. I believe it is the only choice we have left, I said. We wanted to reawaken humanity's fire. Well, there it is. A fire that can burn down the whole forest, cage and all. We either learn to ride it, or we are consumed by it along with everything else. The decision was made. The Bastion, our home and our prison, began its final, desperate maneuver. Engineers, their faces grim with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, began the complex and dangerous process of converting the station's main reactor into a massive neural pulse emitter. We were turning our entire world into a single, specialized tool, a key designed to fit the lock of a monster's mind. The rest of the crew prepared for a hard ride, reinforcing bulkheads, securing supplies, and readying our small fleet of attack ships for the impossible task of docking with a living, hostile weapon of war. As we moved into the path of the approaching Grendel, I spent my final hours in my makeshift library, the images of old Earth flickering on the walls. I wasn't studying schematics or battle plans. I was watching a recording of a child's birthday party, the sound of laughter echoing in the small room. I was trying to remember what we were fighting for. It wasn't for the glory of war or the thrill of defiance. It was for this, For the simple, beautiful, chaotic right to be human. For the right to laugh, to cry, to celebrate a life, however small, under a real sun. The proximity alarms began to chime, a soft, insistent beep that signaled the monster's arrival. I took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting of ozone and finality. I walked toward the newly constructed interface chamber, the saddle as the engineers had grimly nicknamed it. Kaylin met me at the door. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip surprisingly firm. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes other than iron resolve. It was a flicker of something, not hope. It was too late for hope. It was the shared, silent understanding of two people standing on the edge of an abyss, about to take a final, desperate leap. "Bring us home, Archivist," she said. I nodded, unable to speak. I entered the chamber and strapped myself into the interface chair. The monster was upon us. Through the chamber's armored viewport, I saw it a mountain of shifting, iridescent flesh and jagged, metallic bone. Its form a nightmare fusion of biology and technology. It blotted out the stars. It was the end of the world. And it was our only way forward. The old man who had tested me in the crucible was there to make the final connection. He looked at me, his wrinkled face etched with worry. "The beast will fight you," he rasped. "It will try to eat your mind." "I know," I replied, my voice calm. "But I've read more books than it has." He gave a short, barking laugh and engaged the system. My world dissolved into a screaming vortex of alien thought, a consciousness of pure, undiluted hunger and rage. The Leviathan had noticed us, and it was not pleased. The mind of the Grendel was not a mind at all. It was a storm. It was a screaming, timeless abyss of pure, weaponized instinct. For a century it had slept, and now, awakened, it knew only two things: a gnawing, cosmic hunger and a blinding, incandescent rage. To touch its consciousness was to be consumed by a tsunami of raw id, the logic of fang and claw translated into psychic force. It lashed out at me, at the insignificant speck of organized thought that was the Bastion, and I felt the station's structure groan around me, a physical echo of the bioship's psychic assault. The crew was being battered by waves of primal terror, their own disciplined minds threatening to shatter under the psychic onslaught of a creature that was a living embodiment of war. I was at the storm's heart, and it was trying to erase me, to digest my consciousness into its own chaotic furnace. But I did not fight it with force. I answered its scream with a symphony. I opened the floodgates of the anvil and poured a century of stolen history into the void between us. I showed the beast its own birth in the bio-forges of the mechanists, the faces of its creators, men who had dreamed of making a god and had instead birthed a devil. I showed it the battles it had fought, the worlds it had consumed, the raw, glorious purpose for which it had been made. Then I showed it the silence. I showed it the coming of the architects, the folding of the flags, the slow, placid death of the very concept of conflict it had been designed to wage. I did not try to tame its rage. I gave it a target. I took its blind, indiscriminate fury and focused it, like a lens, on the perfect, sterile harmony of the chorus. I offered it a feast worthy of its hunger, the calm, orderly, and utterly defenseless heart of an empire that had forgotten what monsters felt like. The psychic screaming did not stop, but its tenor changed. It was no longer the mindless rage of a caged animal, but the focused, predatory howl of a hunter that has caught the scent of its true prey. A final, convulsive shudder ran through the bastion as the bioship's tendrils, living cables of flesh and metal, reached out, not to crush us, but to anchor us, to fuse our wounded, hollowed-out asteroid to its monstrous back. The feedback loop stabilized. The alarms in the saddle chamber died down to a steady, rhythmic hum. Through the viewport, the starfield began to move, to accelerate at a rate that should have torn our little world to pieces. We were no longer pilot and vessel. We were the rider and the steed, a union of mind and monster, of history and hunger, and we were hurtling toward home. The journey was a fever dream. We tore through the architect's cleansing line, their meticulous drones swatted aside by the Grendel's bioelectric field like insects from a windshield. A cheer, raw and hoarse, went up through the bastion. The first true sound of hope I had heard since my arrival. We watched on our screens as the architect's fleet, those serene, ivory cathedrals of light, finally reacted. They moved to intercept us, not with panic, but with a calm, geometric precision. Their formations perfect. Their weapons fire a coordinated display of lethal elegance. They were everything we were not: clean, orderly, and sane. The battle was joined in the high orbit of Jupiter. The architect's ships fired beams of pure information, weapons designed to dismantle technology at the molecular level, to unwrite matter. But the Grendel was not just technology. It was rage and flesh. For every wound they carved in its flank, it regenerated, its flesh boiling and reforming, angrier than before. It met their surgical precision with brute, impossible force, spewing clouds of self-replicating acid and firing torpedoes that were living, predatory organisms. The Wraiths, led by Silas, flew from the bastion's hangar, their small, ugly fighters weaving through the chaos, drawing fire, protecting the vulnerable connection points between our home and our monstrous steed. It was a battle between a scalpel and a sledgehammer, between a perfect equation and a scream. We were losing. The Grendel, for all its fury, was being systematically dismantled. Jorik, commanding a small squadron of heavy gunships, saw an architect destroyer positioning itself to sever our connection to the beast. His voice came over the comm, steady and devoid of fear. "Kalen," he said, "I finally saw the ocean. It was worth it." He and his squadron turned and flew directly into the destroyer's main weapon array, their ships detonating in a suicidal blaze of glory that crippled the architect vessel and bought us precious time. We were past Mars and Earth. Our long-lost cradle hung in the void ahead, a blue and white jewel wrapped in the shimmering, placid energy of the chorus. The spire of tranquil history was a silver needle pointing toward the heavens, the primary antenna for the great quiet. We were battered, bleeding, and dying. But we had reached the heart of their power, there, in the saddle, fused with the dying mind of the Leviathan. I knew we could not win this fight, but I also knew I didn't have to. The architects had made one fatal error, the same one they had made when they assumed no one would ever run from their cage. They believed the opposite of order was chaos, but I had read the books. I knew the true opposite of their sterile order was not chaos. It was choice. With Kalen's final, desperate approval, I rerouted all of the Bastion's remaining power, every last watt, into the neural emitter. I linked it with the Grendel's vast organic processing core, creating an antenna of impossible scale and sensitivity. I was no longer just the writer, I was the focal point, the broadcast nexus. And I did not broadcast a weapon. I did not send a signal of destruction. I sent them a memory. I sent them everything. I took the anvil, in its entirety, every poem, every battle, every scientific discovery, every love song, every declaration of war, every last beautiful, terrible, contradictory piece of our species' soul, and I pushed it through the spire's own network. I shattered the great quiet with the great cacophony. The psychic feedback was a supernova in my skull. I felt my own consciousness shredding, dissolving into the tidal wave of information I was unleashing. But in that final, agonizing moment, I saw it. On the surface of the earth, a billion minds, sleeping in a gray dream, suddenly woke up. I saw a man in a nutrient factory drop his tools and begin to weep, not knowing why. I saw a woman look up from her placid meditation and scream a name she had not known she remembered. I saw cities of gentle, compliant sheep suddenly erupt into riots of confused, terrified, and gloriously alive wolves. The chorus, that single, perfect, placating note, was drowned out by a billion simultaneous, discordant, and utterly human songs. The effect on the architects was immediate. Their fleet stopped firing. Their perfect geometry wavered. They were beings of absolute order, and we had just unleashed a virus of pure, unadulterated chaos into the heart of their system. They could not fight a billion separate rebellions. They could not reason with a species that had just remembered how to love and hate in the same breath. And so, they did the only logical thing. They left. Their ivory ships turned, not in a panicked rout, but in a silent, coordinated withdrawal, and vanished into the black, leaving behind a solar system that was once again loud, messy, and ours. I awoke days later in the Bastion's infirmary. Kaylin was there. Her face was haggard, her eyes holding a deep, profound exhaustion. But for the first time, there was a light in them that went beyond mere survival. The Grendel, she told me, was silent, its wounds slowly healing. A new, permanent moon in Earth's orbit, a scarred and monstrous guardian tethered to my own recovering mind. We stood together on the Bastion's observation deck, looking down at our home. It was a world on fire. Cities burned, but not from the clean, sterile fire of the architects. They burned with the passionate, chaotic fires of rebirth. We had not brought them peace. We had not brought them victory. We had brought them themselves, and the cost of that gift was a world torn apart, a future that was a terrifying, beautiful, and completely unwritten page. The war was over. The fight had just begun. We had traded the gilded cage for a wilderness, a perfect, simple note for a chaotic, challenging symphony. It was the best bargain humanity had ever made.